The following is a message from Christ Central Manchester, a church that meets in the heart of Manchester in the UK. To find out more about us, please visit www.christcentral.org.uk.
I've already introduced myself. My name's Keith, and I hope you've felt warmly welcome this morning, especially if you're a guest with us this morning. Today we're going to be carrying on in a series that we've dipped in and out of, we've called it the Big Questions series, and we've tried to put together 4 questions that we're going to look at this year. A couple of months ago we asked the question, what does God think about sex? Today we're asking the question, if God exists, why is there suffering? And in a couple of months' time we'll be asking, what does the Bible say about the whole refugee crisis, about the whole immigration issue? Which I think is important for us to get a perspective on, because it may or may not be counter to what you and your friends believe, and we just want to see what the Bible says about that. And then in the autumn we're going to have a guest speaker called Adrian Holloway come and speak to us about the whole topic, or the whole question of, has science buried God? But this one we're looking at this morning, this question of suffering, is one that we all face. Whether you're an atheist, an agnostic, a theist, whatever your worldview, we all have to face the question of suffering at some point or other in our lives. Here are some other common variations that bring it down to a more personal level. This is where it really hits the road. And this morning I don't intend to try and just throw out theory without realising, and I want you to hear loud and clear before we go any further, that I understand that this is not just theory, and that you may well be sat here this morning feeling the intense pain and the acute pain of actual suffering that you are going through and have been going through maybe for even some time. And so I don't want to dismiss your pain, or for you to feel like I'm trying to trivialise your pain or make light of it in any way. If we had time, I would sit with anybody who wanted to and talk through your pain and would love to hear your story. That is genuine. And I understand that there are people in this room who are going through things that I have never been through. And so there will be some theory, but it's not intended to be impersonal or making light of your situation. And this is what I kind of mean. These are the kind of things that people might say. Say we were to give out an invitation to text in your questions on mobile. These are the kind of questions we might receive from people. I can't believe God exists because of all the greed and poverty in the world. That's a bit more of a general one. I can't believe God exists because I lost 2 close relatives to cancer. I can't believe God exists because he allows tsunamis to kill people. Now, in those kind of questions, there are 2 categories of question in there, or 2 categories of suffering. One is what we might label moral evil that results in suffering, and that's when we hurt each other. That's when human evil behaviour results in the suffering of other human beings. That's moral evil suffering. Then we might have a second category of natural suffering. In other words, where people get a disease, that they die from cancer, or they're hit by an earthquake. That would be a second category. And both obviously are tragic and painful, but just we need to just categorise it in that way, and we'll come back to these 2 categories in a moment. And if you can cope with this, those 2 categories, just hold them for a moment. We're then going to look at 3 points this morning. And these 2 categories that I've mentioned will come into this first point especially. But the 3 things we're going to look at this morning. Number 1, we're going to look at a quick answer. Number 2, we're going to look at the logical objection to God in the face of suffering. And thirdly, the emotional objection to God in the face of suffering. I hope that's clear and makes sense. But first of all, a quick answer, and this is important. We have to be honest and say, or I have to be honest and say up front, first of all, before we go anywhere else, that first of all I sympathise with you if you're struggling at the moment. But also that with this whole question, ultimately we have to admit that we don't always know why we suffer. We don't always know why. And that's important to say at the outset. Also, it's important for me just to mention that I'm not going to be able to cover every aspect of this question. It's a huge question that people have been wrestling with for thousands of years, and we're not going to solve it all in 40 minutes. Certainly I'm not. And therefore, you might legitimately be able to say to me at the end of this morning, Keith, you haven't even talked about this area. I admit we probably aren't going to cover a number of areas. But what I do want to say is, first of all, we don't always know, and we need to admit to that. But also, as with most things in life, and church, and the Bible, but in life generally, we try and come up with quick fixes, don't we? Or simplistic solutions and answers that fit every category. We try to simplify things, and that's just not the way life is. Life's always more nuanced, or often more nuanced and more complicated than we want it to be. So ultimately, we don't know why God allows suffering, and we must start there. And the reason I want to say that, and this is where I want to come back to these two categories, is that there are different categories of suffering, broadly speaking, in these two categories. And some will say, you see, some will try and come up with a quick fix that fixes it all. Because they will say, well, God allows suffering to teach us a lesson, or to discipline us, or to improve our character. The Bible even talks about suffering producing perseverance. And therefore, we mustn't worry about suffering. It's for our good. I'm sorry, it doesn't always work like that. It can't fix, it can't be the answer for every single category of suffering. First of all, it doesn't answer this question. Why is it certain people with, let's just say, questionable character suffer a lot less than sometimes we would say good people suffer? We know people that are very, very good and upright, and they suffer lots. And people who could do with a bit of suffering, maybe, don't suffer at all. There's no improving of their character going on. In fact, they're just getting worse. Some also will argue that God doesn't allow suffering. It's people that cause suffering. It's just all people and our fault and our doing. And again, that's true of certain types of suffering. We've already talked about moral evil resulting in suffering, war, killing, rape. You know, when we harm each other, when we violate each other's worth and value, we step into the suffering resulting from moral evil. But that's not all suffering. It's not true to say that all suffering is a direct result of human evil. And even if you were to go further down that route and say, well, it's because we do things wrong at all, we've allowed wrong, we've allowed sin into the world, and therefore wrong stuff happens, and therefore our planet is sick because we've allowed wrong stuff in, and that's why we get disasters and natural disasters. Again, that doesn't fully explain on a logical or even an emotional level why the baby of a good person might die from natural causes and why the baby of a murderer might live. It doesn't answer every question. Because we've let wrong into the world, therefore babies die. Or volcanoes erupt and kill people. It doesn't explain it. It doesn't, on a logical or emotional level, always work. Another overly simplistic approach might be to say that we live in a world of physical laws. It's not a one-size-fits-all answer either. It's true. Physical law might mean that if I was to stand on the metro tracks above us, which you can sometimes hear the trams rumbling past, that's what that noise is, in case you ever wondered. No, not as stupid as me. You'd obviously realise there's a tram line up there. But if I was to stand on that tram line after the service and stand there until something happened, I'd probably get hit by a tram because of the physical laws involved. And I'd probably die or get very seriously injured because of the physical situation involved. But that doesn't explain why some people suffer from the results of physical laws more than others. It doesn't explain why some people die in a car crash or a tornado or from Ebola when other people don't. We can't always tick boxes and categorise things neatly off and say, well, that's suffering of that kind, and therefore that's nice and neat. It doesn't always work. The Bible, let me just say, is full of suffering. Right from the start to the end, it's got suffering all the way through. And And it attempts to come to terms with suffering, but it never gives a one-size-fits-all explanation. The Bible doesn't do that. It knows, God knows, that there is so much more to it than that. The book of Job, for example, which is one long book about suffering. I happen to be reading it at the moment in my own personal devotions. The book of Job is all about one man's suffering, incredible suffering. He loses everything. And the main point really, or one of the main points is, don't expect to be able to explain this away. His friends do so well. I don't know if you've ever read the book of Job. His 3 friends do so well. They just sit with him. I think it's for 7 days to start with. They sit with him in utter silence, just identifying with his pain. He's lost his family. He's lost his livelihood. He's lost his home, I think. Parts of his property have been blown down. And they just sit with him. It's when they begin to speak that they begin to blow it. They begin to do these things that I've talked about. They begin to try and put everything in a pigeonhole and say, that's why you're suffering, Job. One of the messages of Job's story is, you can't always explain suffering away. Suffering, as I've said already, can fit one of these categories. Like, we can't really, for me, blame God when people kill other people. Maybe we can blame him or ask him questions about why that is even allowed to happen. But directly, we can't say that's God's fault if somebody decides to shoot somebody else. But in all of this, there is not always a nice, neat explanation. We just have to admit, and this is what I want to say at the beginning with this quick first answer, we just sometimes don't know. I don't know why your sister got cancer at a young age, or why somebody died unexpectedly in their sleep prematurely, or that car crash that took your friend. I'm terribly sorry, I don't know, is the most honest answer that I can give you this morning. And sometimes you will need to give friends who ask you because you believe in God and therefore they're going to possibly even blame you, or ask you for an explanation. Sometimes the easiest thing or the best thing, the most helpful thing, is to say, I don't know. But does that mean that God can't exist? Because that's where then people do often go. If this stuff is happening, then God surely cannot exist. It doesn't make sense. And that's where I want us to go next. The logical objection to God. And some of you are sitting here this morning thinking, well, look at this. The preacher himself can't even give us a reason for suffering. He can't even answer the question. He's admitting defeat before he's even got going. And you might be thinking, along this logical route or this logical track right now, and there have been people on your logical track for hundreds and thousands of years before you. You are not alone. People in recent times like I don't know if you call him an actor or a comedian or what he is, or thinker, Stephen Fry, he said if he met God, he's an atheist, but he said if he met God, he would say this: bone cancer in children? What's all that about? It's an old question, it's a lot older than Stephen Fry. Ancient philosophers such as Epicurus have asked it. He asked it in 300 BC, it should be on the screen. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent, all-powerful. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent, evil. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? It's the same question, just asked in a slightly fancier way by that guy. It's the same question. And we can ask the question in slightly different ways, but I want to give you the basic problem in more detail on the screen right now. Number one. Keep going, please. Hopefully it's there. Number one, I want to this is kind of a simplified kind of explanation of this argument. This is the basic problem that we have, or that many of our friends might try to communicate, maybe not in this way, but this is the basic problem. An all-powerful, number one, an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God would not allow suffering. Number two, suffering exists. Number three, therefore, an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God does not exist. It makes sense, doesn't it? Logically flows. On the surface, at least, it makes sense. But there's a problem. In fact, there's a couple of problems. One we will come back to in the emotional objection to God. But first of all, here's one problem. In fact, let me just give you an outline of that other objection that we'll come back to in a moment. So there's an emotional, in the emotional objection to God in a moment, we'll look at this reason, and that is this on the screen. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist, nor does evil, nor does suffering. Number 2, objective moral values and evil and suffering that go with that do exist. And number 3, therefore God exists. That's a kind of a flip round. We know stuff goes wrong, and if stuff goes wrong, then there must be good and evil, and if good and evil exist, therefore God must exist. Okay, so we'll come back to that in the emotional objection in a moment. But also, many philosophers will struggle with our first set of values or assumptions. Many philosophers will struggle with that first set of statements because it assumes something that we really can't assume. It assumes that first set of 3 arguments that we just looked at assumes that if God had a good reason to allow suffering, then I would know it. That's the underlying assumption. So let's put it back on the screen, but with this little added argument in the mix. A more accurate, revised version of that first 3-point statement would be this. Number 1, an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God would not allow suffering without a good reason. I cannot think of such a good reason. Number 2. Number 3, therefore there isn't one. Number 4, suffering exists. Number 5, therefore an all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God does not exist. Just take that in for a moment. You might just need to read that again. Now, most societies have not gone this way. We've started to go here in the last couple of 100 years. We've started to think that anything God would think or know, we would probably know it, and we would probably understand it. That's how we've begun to go in the last couple of 100 years. All major religions have emerged in societies where there was no pain relief, where child mortality rates were much higher, and yet it is our modern society that's more comfortable and safer that struggles the most with suffering, it would seem. Why have these societies in history had less of a problem with suffering than us? Because this is how they probably have approached it. On the screen again, it's another version of what we've just looked at. An all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing God would not allow suffering without a good reason. Number 2, I cannot think of such a good reason. Number 3, my knowledge, however, is hugely limited. Number 4, suffering exists. Number 5, this is a mystery. That makes sense? So in the last couple of 100 years, we've done the previous, but before that, and probably around the world, the majority of the world still is in this boat. Happy, well not happy, but open to the possibility that we might not know exactly why all these things happen. The difference for us is we think we would know if there was a good reason for suffering. It's a bit like if you were to ask me to look out onto a field of grass, no trees, and it's important, no big things for anything to hide behind, and you said to me, Keith, is there a horse in that field? I would be able to tell you, as long as my eyes were okay, I'd be able to tell you if there was a horse in that field or not. Again, hopefully there's no big trucks or trees or anything that the horse could hide behind. But I'd know, because a horse is quite a large animal. But if you asked me to tell you if there was a midgie in the field, I wouldn't be able to tell you if that was true or not, unless it was right up close and trying to bite me. I wouldn't be able to tell you that, would I? Our assumption nowadays is that any good reason for suffering would be more like a horse than a midgie. We would know if it was there or not. At a logical level, this is how we can begin to engage with the problem of suffering and evil in the world. In there is this assumption that I would know the reasons for suffering, even though I'm not all-knowing, but we are talking about, at least in theory, an all-knowing God. So the assumption does not quite stack up. He might know a reason that I don't yet see, because it's a midgie, not a horse. Number 3, the emotional objection to God. We've looked at this quick answer that we need to be honest. Sometimes we've looked at the logical objection to God. Now I want us to just engage with the emotional objection in this last point. For most, the objection is not purely logical. In fact, for probably everybody who's ever lived, the objection is not just logical, but it's emotional as well. It's at least a mixture, if not more emotional than it is logical. Like Stephen Fry, how can God exist when children die? We must understand and sympathise with the heart cry of people. As I said earlier, much of the Bible is written by people who lament, wail and cry out in the midst of suffering. I know people who have gone through terrible loss and suffering and pain and who have denounced God and his existence. I know of other people who've gone through similar, possibly even worse suffering and pressed into God. Far from denouncing his existence, they have clung to him for dear life. You will know of people that have done it both. You will know of people that have said God doesn't exist. They may have even been a theist, a believer in God. May have even called themselves a Christian. And they've denounced God because of suffering. Or they didn't even call themselves a Christian, or maybe they were agnostic to start with, and now they're definitely an atheist because of suffering. Or you may know others who've gone through incredible suffering and yet have said, I'm going to press into God, I'm going to cling to him. I don't know why this happened, but I believe he is still there. And all I want to do this morning is illustrate that there are two emotional responses to suffering. And we've gone through all these other arguments, but this is where I want us to really finish off. I want us to see there are two emotional responses to suffering. Number one, there is no God. And number two, that God is there and he helps me through, but he is still there. And I want us to make clear that the second one is not just possible, but it's valid. You don't have to shoot yourself you don't have to drop your brain in the bin to believe that God is possibly still there. More than that, God I know is there, and I'm clinging to him. The first option, we might call it the skeptical view, because it's skeptical about God's existence. That says there is no God, and that's where many of our friends, or many people in the UK would be. They would be in this option, at least 1 foot in this option. And this is the problem I said we would come back to. In this view, there is no such thing as objective evil. There's no such thing as good. If you take the argument that God wouldn't allow suffering if he really existed, therefore he just can't exist. But if we take that view, if we go down that view fully, then there is no such thing as good. If you let this view play out fully, there's no such thing as evil. There's only the physical realm. There's no good, there's no evil. We live, we die. There's no objective way of saying that something is evil. We get ill, we die young, we are buried, and we take any evil into the ground with us without any hope, any chance of justice, any chance of righting wrongs. Atheist Richard Dawkins put it like this. He said, in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, and other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good. Remember this bit. No evil and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. That's the logical conclusion of the stance that says, I can't cope with God's existence, there's too much rubbish going on in the world. The logic, if you go down that route, eventually you end up saying something like that. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. A couple of years ago, in 2013, England were playing Australia at cricket. Now, I'm not into cricket that much, except when England play Australia, or like the T20, I quite like that. I can't cope with 5 days of cricket and it's a draw. Just can't do it. Sorry, there's some serious nodding going on. But anyway, this was a famous match, and I can get into even the 5-day version if it's Australia. England are playing Australia. Stuart Broad had been caught, but the umpire had not seen Stuart Broad's bat hit the ball. He was technically out. Right? Because of the appeal system and because of the way cricketers have morally changed, in the old days, Stuart Broad, I'm sure he knew he touched the ball with the bat. In the old days, he would have walked off the pitch and admitted, I was out. Nowadays, they tend to stand there and wait to see what the umpire says. Well, he stood his ground and was allowed to stay in, even though video replays and all the technology they show nowadays shows that he definitely touched the ball and should have been given out. Dawkins, the guy that just said that about DNA dancing to its music, Dawkins tweeted his and he's English, tweeted his outrage at this English batsman's behaviour. Said he's going to support Australia for the rest of the series, I think. The backlash on Richard Dawkins on Twitter was swift. After all, Stuart Broad was just dancing to his DNA. G.K. Chesterton, in his book Orthodoxy, put it like this. The new rebel is a skeptic and will not entirely trust anything. Should be on the screen. He has no loyalty, or she has no loyalty, therefore he can never really be a revolutionist. And the fact that he doubts everything really gets in his way when he wants to denounce anything. For all denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind, and the modern revolutionist doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. Forget that bit. Move on to this bit. As a politician, he will cry out that war is a waste of life, and then as a philosopher, that all life is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant, and then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts. Then he takes his hat and umbrella and goes to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is always engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt has become practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he has lost his right to rebel against anything. In other words, you can't have objective morality or an objective good and an objective evil without God. There is nowhere to measure from. We have to somehow come up with something else. And who's to say we're right? We have to come up with a moral code from somewhere. But we all have a hunch. So if you follow the DNA example for a moment, then there is no good and evil. The problem we've got is, in real life, we've all got a hunch that 9/11 was wrong. We've got a hunch. Something iffy about 9/11, morally. Or the Paris attacks, or the Crusades. There's something also wrong, there's a hunch about natural disasters and suffering and illness that lead to death. We think there is a bigger reason why these things are wrong, but we daren't say it because we might sound like we're not an atheist anymore. The emotional response to suffering that ends by saying there is no God offers no help, no emotional support, and the experience of suffering demands help and support. There is nothing satisfying, nothing helpful, nothing to speak into the real world of emotional pain in suffering, even if it's a cricket match, for goodness sake. There is no evil, there is only physical. There is no evil, there is no good, we just live and we die. That's the first response. Without God. The second view, that God is there and helping me through, is not saying that there is suffering, therefore God can't possibly exist, but that there is suffering. So can we find evidence in our universe of a God who might have an answer to the suffering? That's the second response. If Jesus is real, if his story is true, if human evil is objectively real, if suffering is objectively real, then can it be true that Jesus enters into that real evil and real suffering, Can it be true that real evil is then defeated? Can it be true that death is defeated? Can it be true that real love wins? Can it be true that the world one day will be made right? Can it be true? The contrast is remarkable. It doesn't answer every question, but there's hope in the second option, I would argue. One of these two options has immense power to emotionally uphold people who suffer. The other one is powerless, empty, and hopeless. Even though I will look at suffering and say I still don't always know, I can look at suffering and say it's not that God doesn't love me. I see his love in the cross. Jesus entered this suffering world and suffered himself. He is not distant from us, but totally loving, totally involved, and cares so much that he suffered the most cruel death imaginable. Then he rose again to defeat its power and to one day make all things new. Looking at Jesus means that I can say, and this is my personal story, or a small part of it, looking at Jesus means I can say, I don't know why my mum's twin died at birth. I don't know why close friends of ours as a family are growing up lost their daughter at the age of 9 to a brain tumour. I don't know why one of my school friends died in a car crash. And I don't know why my wife's cousin's baby was stillborn. I don't know, ultimately. But looking at Jesus, I know it's not because he doesn't love me or us. He proved that on the cross. It doesn't answer every question you have, or I have, or your friends might have. If you would like to talk further, honestly, I would count it a privilege to talk with you. I'll be down around here after the service just for a few minutes. If you wanted to talk with me afterwards about the particular things that I've left out, or the questions you've still got, then I'd love to talk with you. Or you can write something on your Connect cards that are in your drinks holders, and we would love to get back to you. It'll be confidential. But thank you for coming and listening this morning, especially if you're a guest who's been brought along this morning. And I just want to say thank you for coming, especially if this has been a painful topic for you. In closing, if the band would like to come back up, we're just going to finish with a very short time of singing together and worshipping together. As we do that, the offering buckets will go around, and that will be the opportunity to put your Connect cards in. We'd love to get your feedback on this morning, and also to hear from you if you want to sign up for anything. But as we finish with this short time of worship together, please do let this be a time, and this is for you, whether you would call yourself a Christian or in your own words you would say you're not a Christian. Let this be a time where, if you need to, sit or stand and just reflect, because this is very real for you, then please do take that moment just to reflect. And I would encourage you, whatever your faith, whatever your worldview, I'd encourage you to say, God, if you're there, will you please make yourself known to me and make yourself real to me? I'm really going through some painful suffering. I'm really feeling this at the moment, and I need you. I would encourage you, just reach out to him and ask him to help you with your pain and with your questions. Because I'm confident that he will draw very close to you as you do that. Thank you for listening.